Ladies and gentlemen, so welcome to the third event of the series, Platform and Digital Markets Regulations, organized by the Digital Markets Competition Forum initiative here at Copenhagen Business School. So today we speak particularly on this, the idea about what kind of principles and criteria we should adopt when thinking about competition in digital markets. Now, digital markets based on digital platforms have become the go-to sales channel for customers and producers, as well as service providers across a number of sectors. And the sectors it's in itself is a growing number. Now, for their ability to coordinate multiple actors and manage interactions, digital platforms have created large benefits for consumers and new economic opportunities and efficiencies. Now, the same dynamics, though, that have made platforms popular among users are now elements of major concerns for antitrust policy. And the current regulatory debate on digital markets and the need to regulate digital platforms is basically anchored on two fundamental points. So the first is the network effects dynamics. Basically, the concern is that successful platforms can leverage network effects dynamics to entrench their market position, expand their service and network to adjacent markets, entering new sectors, and protect themselves from rivals' entry and competition. The second point is control over data. And here the concern is that big platforms have superior capacity to generate in the first place, aggregate and leverage a large amount of data to create customer lock-in and strong barriers for new competitors. Now, a number of reports, as you know, have been produced. There's been a lot of discussion around, the past months, identifying some practices as potentially problematic. And here you have a list I compiled by looking at all the different, material out there, but they basically range from self-preferencing of own products to the data collection and control or bundling of products. And accordingly, some of the remedies that have been proposed are targeting these exact practices. However, how we shall treat these practices may change depending on how we see platforms themselves, right? So the dominant view is that platforms are basically market channels, right? So that are driving value by enhancing efficiency in transactions. Now, this view, essentially platforms are matchmakers, right? So digital infrastructures connecting actors on the demand side and supply side. So essentially the markets exist out there and the platforms just having a superior technology to connect them. And so they offer a way to solve essentially potential market failures, problems, right? But reducing the transaction frictions and matching users in a superior way compared to what you will do in traditional markets, which is basically just the price-based system, right? So in this sense, it's the idea that their role is a gateway to the market. The market is out there, they just, build basically gateways. As matchmakers, we know that, platforms are subject to the well-known winner-take-all logic. So this is coming from the indirect network effects dynamics, so that the platform that managed to attract more users on both sides will offer greater efficiencies to users, be more valuable, and might, thus quickly end up being the only one to serve the entire market, right? And this is one of the idea why we also have a concern, right, of cornering the market. But platforms are more than that. So they are more than just a tool to enhance transaction efficiency. Platforms are also ecosystem orchestrators. So they also manage ecosystem. They are shaping interactions and coordinating multiple actors to drive innovation, also in complementary products and service that can enhance the platform value to its users. And that's one of the major reasons why users like to hook to a platform and even stick to a platform, because they have an even greater expanding of options out there. So in this view, as ecosystem orchestrators, largely based particularly in the innovation strategy literature, platforms are new organizational forms for organizing innovation in a way that offers convenient integrated solutions to customers, right? So there are primarily innovation infrastructures rather than just markets that allow to solve possible innovation coordination failures, particularly in those contexts where multiple actors need to come together in the first place to offer a variety of interconnected components and complements, and which can then offer value to the customers. So the platform can both, in this sense, drive greater innovation by external firms, but also innovate itself in complementary products and services. And that's what we observe, right, in many of these contests, that they create new markets along with the gates of access to them, right? So that basically their product and service offer at the same time a way to expand the markets and value, but also for consumers to access the ecosystem. So it's a way for the consumers to get into the complementary products. And that's a point that we tried to make in a recent article with my co-authors, Michael Jacobidis and Annabelle Gower, where we can, we distinguish between these two sets of ecosystems, so that besides coordinating the so-called multi-actor ecosystem, digital platforms also enhance their value through the multi-product ecosystem. So the collections of products and service that come together, right, to create this attractive solution for the customer. So this platforms, firms, products, and service, right, cannot be viewed in isolation when considering the competitive antitrust aspects, right, but must be assessed, this is a key implication, within the all value generation capacity of the platform ecosystem as a whole, right? It's not as a piece separated. So, this is why we need a view that integrates these two dimensions, right? And so if we see platforms only for a purely efficiency logic, what we might basically miss what is truly the distinctive nature of platform competition here, that essentially is about alternative modes or modalities, right, of organizing economic activities and markets. So how do we proceed and think about regulating platform competition? Which principles should we adopt to assess and promote platform competition? So that's the kind of million dollar questions that I have for the forum today, and we'll debate about these issues during the forum. In good company with a terrific lineup of speakers who you can see them. And so thank you all for joining the forum. And a special thank goes to my colleague, Joanna from CBS, with whom I shared the pleasure of moderating the debate. So we'll now give the floor to our first keynote speaker, Jacques Cremer, professor of economics at Toulouse School of Economics. He will will address the audience with an opening high-level remarks on these issues. Then we will have a time to for some questions. Before then, we move into the very first panel discussion. Thanks you all. I hope you will enjoy the forum. Please use the chat to put your questions there for the panelists. And Jacques, I give now the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Sorry for the mess which I'm doing here. So as Carmelo said, I'm going to do a few very high remarks about the way in which I think we have to think about the regulatory challenges that we are facing. My basic message is, it is true that we are entering a very different world where we need to rethink the way we are regulating at least part of the economy. And my second message is that we have lots of tools available, and we should be trying to think about how we integrate all those tools rather than being focused on one tool, which is competition policy, or two tools, competition policy and regulation. So very briefly, I'm going to begin speaking by competition policy and then change the focus. The foundation of traditional competition policy were that we had all sorts of theories and very good theoretical background to believe that markets were efficient. Okay, going from Adam Smith to Walras to Arrow and Debreu. If I were English, I would have put Marshall in there. But we also knew that the real world did not function as general equilibrium theory describes for lots of ways, but in particular, firms have got incentives to become monopoly and get extra profits. And then in some industries, the conditions for existence of competition are not met, and hence we can't have competition. So what we did then is that we had instruments to ensure that every industry worked as close as possible to the competitive ideal. Okay, so that's what competition policy was supposed to do, bang on the head of people who were trying to create illegal monopolies. And that's what regulation was trying to do, which was to, when we are industries in which conditions were not met for competition, we tried to impose a competitive mode in some sense through administrative fiat. But in some sense, it was essential for the theory of those types of intervention that the deviation from the competitive ideal be at the margin. Okay, it's not necessarily clear that you want one industry to be competitive if the rest of the industries are not competitive. So you really had to, all of this work in the industry was relatively close to the general equilibrium model. Now, as I will argue very briefly, none of this reasoning holds for the digital economy. I know that some people disagree, but I think that's true. And then there's a question of what should we do in this case. Okay. So what is different? Okay, I promise I won't go through all this slide, but here I've listed a number of characteristics of the digital industries, which are typical, which are frequent in digital industries. All of those characteristics exist in other industries or existed in some other industry. I mean, electricity distribution had increasing returns to scale. The role of intellectual property is very important in pharmaceutical and so on. But they exist at a very, very high level in the digital industry. Okay, and they're all present there, and in a way, which changes things considerably. So to come back to Carmelo's presentation of platforms, okay, Carmelo said, that platforms put, for instance, buyers and sellers together, but platforms also organize the market on which those buyers and those sellers are interacting. And hence we've got lots of private marketplaces. And we really don't have a theory of how an economy works when you have lots of private marketplaces and how the competition between private marketplaces functions. So all those are lots of different issues. So there's lots of challenges which arise in this case. Okay, there are first competition policy challenges. So first, as an academic, you say, well, in the long run, we need to develop a new theory. We don't know exactly what the efficient solution is. We should do more research, okay? And I'm perfectly willing to go and say that loud and get more money for our universities to do more research. But in the short run, we have a real problem of how do we adapt the tools that we have while we are waiting for the resolution of the long-term issues. And I think that's really the difficult debate which exists now in the world. Okay? And I should add, there are lots of people who say, well, the world doesn't function that badly. We really shouldn't do anything. But the big platforms have huge social implications. And I won't list them, but we can discuss them at length. And that makes us, those issues are very important, and that the political pressure for some type of regulation is very strong. So I think it's very, very important that people get involved into how can we do regulations which create some good and not too much harm, rather than trying to discuss, should we have regulation, which I think is a debate which is, it's gone. Okay, there will be regulation. So if we think of competition policy, there are basically three approaches which are taken by people. Some people say competition policy is okay. I know the way it works. I don't think it's true, okay? Some people say that we need very strong structural remedies like splitting Facebook, Google, and so on. I don't think that we can do that because we really can't predict the consequences, okay? And my approach, which was also the approach which we had with Yves-Alexandre de Montjoie and Heike Schweitzer in our report of the European Commission, is how can we try to reform competition policy? But what I want to stress today is that competition policy is not alone. There are lots and lots of other tools which exist, okay? The economy is also controlled by labor law, by consumer protection law, by regulation, and so on. And those different regulatory mechanisms have co-evolved over time in order to regulate the traditional economies. But in the digital sphere, they've got a different type of relationship to each other. Okay, so for instance, are drivers of ride-hailing apps employees? Okay, we treat this as a competition issue, but it's really a labor law issue, and maybe we should be changing labor law rather than thinking of this as a competition or as a regulatory issue. So we should really look at the problems and go from the problems to what is the tool to be used, rather than taking one tool and try to solve all the problem. And that creates a very difficult institutional design, political design problem. Let me just say a few words about regulation, because this is a fashionable topic right now. First, notice that regulation is a very ill-defined term. People say we need regulation, but for instance, some of competition policy is actually regulatory in nature. Everything which is per se illegal, it's basically a regulation. You can't do this, okay? There is a very, very difficult question. Do we do that in the competition authority or in a separate body? In the British have chosen to do that in the competition authority, with their new digital markets unit. They are helped by this, by the fact that their competition authority is also a consumer protection authority, which means that it's got more tools than a standard competition authority. And one thing to stress, I think it's very, very important that we have flexibility and experimentation. And for instance, some people complain about the unintended, negative unintended consequences of a GDPR. It probably would have been better if we had a more flexible type of regulation so that we could adapt the GDPR as we get more experience. Okay. One last remark about all of this, or two last remarks. Okay, the first one, it would help very much if we had a better understanding of the economics of regulation. And I don't mean so much about economics of what regulation does, but more understanding of the economics of regulatory agencies. So there was some theories about this in the 1990s. We've completely stopped as economists to work on it, and somebody really needs to begin working about how do we design regulatory agencies, and in particular, how do different regulations interface with each other. And huge amount of more work is needed here, both empirical, institutional, more applied. And the last point, which I will just show you by a picture, the EU just came up with a communication on a new EU-US agenda for global change, where they explain how they want to reset the the transatlantic relationship in case Biden really succeeds in stealing the US election. That's a joke, okay? Lots of it has to do with the regulation of digital platforms. And there's a real issue about how do we manage this in an international framework where a different country, where the firms are global, but the regulatory agencies are regional or national. And I'm really looking forward to the roundtable and before that to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacques. So I think that, there are some very important points here. So even more meat on the table, but that's exactly what I was looking for. Let's see if we have, please from the audience, if you have questions, you can use the chat. And we are already, I think we have our hands raised there. So, yes. Okay, Annabelle, you can speak now.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacques. That was amazing. I had a question, which is you said, and I completely agree with you, that it is an institutional and political problem. The problem of designing the modalities of regulation and the institutional arrangement to make it happen. If that's so, I was a little bit surprised by your conclusion that we need more economics of regulation. Don't you think that people in management studies that studied institutional arrangements or organization and political sciences would also probably be the first one to have insights on this? I know it's a bit of a provocative question, but I wanted to know your view.
So your sentence is, I can see that you're speaking with the two sides of your mouth. You say, are also, and the first one. I mean, clearly we need, we need everybody here. Okay, so here I'm especially aware of the fact that economists who really, for instance, there's lots of theories of independence of regulators and things of that order, which existed 20 years ago, and economists have totally abandoned it. Okay, a discipline. Should join, okay. And we should have communication between the different disciplines.
Okay. And one super quick question. Do you think, what is your one-line view or in terms of process about the regulation of content, of online content? Do you have any suggestion as to how that should go?
I don't know if I dare say this publicly, but let me try. I think one thing which we could think about is there's clearly a problem of asking, the big platforms to be publishers, okay? Because we don't want to burden them with, we don't have to have a monopoly responsibility in some sense of deciding what's legal or not. Maybe one way we could think about is asking them to decentralize, have a centralized platform so we get the benefits of the network effects, okay, but have on those platforms different publishers who would be responsible for the content of the part for which they are publishers, and people who join the platform could, especially, could choose which publisher they join, and hence we could have a decentralized responsibility and have some kind of intermediate solution. But I haven't thought about it. I think we could probably use some imagination in order to try to solve that problem.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the wonderful work you have done in this. It's really been so helpful to so many. So I know I speak for many people to say thank you, Jacques.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. So give you time for the questions, but I had, this question, and it goes a little bit along the lines of Annabelle here, although with a slightly different angle. So you were speaking about, that there are some issues, obviously, that might not be necessarily competition, but, involve also other parts, right? Like the example you made is terrific, right? I mean, the labor there, right, market. But I would push back a little bit there, right? So don't we run into the risk of, parceling this, which is basically, and then, missing basically the complex picture there. So in other words, if by, regulated by labor law and we focus just some specific, rights, and we want for some reason to push and say that there are employees of these platforms, right? Incidentally, the implication of that is that basically we're saying that, this ride-hailing platforms, they are not platforms anymore, or at least they are not multi-sided platforms as we conceive, right? I mean, both in the econ and management literature, because, the one essence, right, of having this independent side is gone, just because by definition now we have a law that says, that those need to be treated as employees.
So, so when I express myself badly, okay, I think it's clear that they cannot be considered as employees, and that's very bad for competition. Okay. On the other hand, it's clear that there is a problem as considering them as normal independent contractors, because their dependence on the platform is stronger than what those statuses are normally like. And on top of that, there are people who usually don't have very high revenues, and hence they would need things like benefits, health care, and so on. So when I'm saying it's a labor law problem, I'm saying what we should do is to be more imaginative in the labor law to provide a new status, statute in French. We love that very much in French. So that people we can provide them some of the benefits of being an employee, which are appropriate, while keeping the benefits of the flexibility which they enjoy, and which is also very important for multi-roaming and for competition law. And it's in that sense I say this problem could be better. We should ask, what is the fundamental problem? The fundamental problem is that all those people, and we're going to have more of them, who are working as semi-independent workers, okay, we need to find a way by which they can have some stability of benefits, some stability of health benefits, retirement benefits, and so on. How do we change the labor law to provide them this without creating too many distortion on the competition side and on the way the platforms are doing? And so it's a difficult challenge, but I think that's where it should be solved.
So will this require, to build then, at least coordination among the different bodies?
Okay, so what I think is, I haven't really worked on it, okay, by my kind of theory. What I think is happening is that we have different types of regulation which have co-evolved over the years, okay? And each of them has developed some competence in both sense of the term, some competence in terms of what they're responsible for, and some competence in terms of what they know how to do, okay? In a world which is changing very fast, it seems to me that we could think about, how do we reorganize the interfaces between those different regulations. And I think there's a really interesting challenge which I haven't seen picked up enough, including by me, by the way. If I were serious, I would be working on it.
Okay, thank you. On that note, I think, you are serious, and you're also giving a lot of service by participating in a forum like that. Actually, I don't want to feel bad that we're wasting some of your productivity time. Actually, I think this is actually, the kind of a conversation that I think we also need to have. So, mindful of time, thank you very much, Jacques, for your introductory remarks. Very effective, and I think I will address those points now. Moving to the first panel on exactly this point. So, how do we make these platforms markets more contestable without giving away part of this new organizational forms that have allow for enhanced innovation, opportunities and value creation in this way. Our panelists to unmute themselves so we can start our own debate, and I'd probably call first on Marco with a tackle, I will say, right? So. Is this idea of the gatekeeper, right? Now going back to management, econ sort of clash is this idea of gatekeeping the right principle to anchor all the debate and the discussion? And I'm asking this also, mindful of your work, and particularly the latest work on AI and how, incumbent firms or firms in incumbent industry, right, they're now leveraging digital dynamics, and they are moving into, platform-based models. So we don't have to just, look at the existing identities of the existing platforms, but have also a look forward at what other firms will be coming into the scene. So Marco, what is your take on this?
No, thank you, Carmelo. Delighted to be here, and thank you, Jacques, for a truly great talk. I was trying to figure out if I could steal some of the slides, but then I thought deeply about the ethics of that and not. But thank you. It was really well put and well presented. So yeah, no, I think the idea of gatekeepers is a very interesting idea, because for me, it's first of all, it's fantastic that the world is really starting to look at the economics of networks in a serious way, right? Because the gatekeeper role is one that makes sense as you think about the digital connectedness of the economy and the relative power of various economic agents, and basically the hubs of the economic network. So let's think about this for a minute, because of the massive investments in digital technology over many years now, our entire economy today is connected through digital networks, and the kinds of relationships that the European Competition Authority and others are worrying about are created by the existence of a vast common network that links now essentially every company to virtually every consumer. We've gone from an economy in which industries and markets are easily separated and carved out into one in which digital connections have linked everything together into one massive, highly interconnected network. And this is a big deal because networks behave really differently. And as we think about this, we need to respect the science of networks and what we know about how networks function. And it's a very different problem. It's complicated, hard to talk about in 5 minutes. And it's very different from the traditional view of economics in which you really think about separate industries. And the one thing that I did not agree with in Jacques' talk is the idea of a digital industry. I don't think there is such a thing as a non-digital industry out there. I can't think of one. Even lobster fishing, I'm sure it's connected by networks. So the networks really comprise everything, and it's not about 5 companies being different or 4 companies being different, it's GAFA. We are all nodes in this massive economic networks, and some nodes are intrinsically more connected than others. These are the network hubs, the gatekeepers. Some people even call them the keystones a while back, if you like gold towers, right? So, and these networks are incredibly valuable. Like the whole network effect is about value creation. It's not intrinsically a problem. I mean, the fax machine was very, very useful for a very long time, right? And it's not just an efficiency argument. I mean, there's a lot of new value that's being created by these networks. And so we need to figure out how to harvest, manage, and where we do need regulate effectively, as Jacques said. But billions of people, millions of small businesses find these networks really valuable, and they cannot function without them. And so is watch out for structural remedies, because the damage is something that is hard to foresee and forecast. So back to gatekeepers for a second. First of all, just a couple of things. Gatekeepers are not only bad, but they're also good, because they perform a really important role in value creation and network or ecosystem preservation, right? And it's so, the fact that Jacques' presentation eventually presented was a function of, sort of some of these gatekeepers actually getting their functionality right. Second, there are gatekeepers everywhere, and there are many organizations that fit that general definition. So if you look at popular definitions of gatekeepers out there, the number of obvious gatekeepers is increasing, and it's huge. Essentially, anyone that's more connected than others is functionally a gatekeeper, and it will have more power on its own subnetwork of people surrounding it. And you see gatekeepers from payment systems to surgical robots, from agricultural equipment to food services and everywhere else. Third, there are big gatekeepers and small gatekeepers, and small gatekeepers can exert a lot of power too. The industries have a characteristic size, right? So you need a few $1 billion of revenues to make up an industry. Networks don't work that way. The internet is a scale-free network, which means that we have clustering at every scale. So you got big, huge networks of billions of people, you got tiny networks of 4 people, but if those 4 people really depend on you, you can have a lot of market power over those 4 people. And you know, sort of Facebook is a gatekeeper, so is LinkedIn, so is the New York Times, so is the Harvard Business Review, and so is the high school newspaper. In each of those cases, you have a lot of market power. Fourth, if you get rid of one gatekeeper, and this is why I love the statement about structural remedies from Jacques, is that if you just get rid of one or split it up or whatever, another one will emerge. There is a law in the economics of networks called preferential attachment that basically says that whoever is more attached is likely to become even more attached, right? Because there's a preference to attach to things that are already attached. It's how networks work and evolve. And so, yeah, traffic begets traffic on the internet, and a hub that's more connected will gather more connections. So you split up this big hub. First, you have a huge efficiency problem and lots of dislocations for lots of people. And on top of it, over time, the hubs will grow back to essentially have that same function, right? You split up Facebook, somebody else is going to come in. It's just the way that networks evolve. Again, there's no characteristic industry size. You can't fix the industry. You got to evolve the networks. And so as we embrace the nature of network theory in economics, I think we need to do it for real. So networks are different. They have different structural properties. You can, multi-homing, disintermediation, a big deal. Networks at different level of cohesiveness, which leads to dramatically different levels of network effect strength. And the data story is even more complicated, and generalities sometimes don't help. So traditional assumptions of like strong network effects, winner take all, are extremely rare and often quite naive as you look at markets. So we need to really understand how to measure the stuff and how to sort of, really think about it from a network's perspective. I guess that's sort of the bottom line. And so the gatekeepers concept, I think, is the first step, but I think we've got a lot more work to do.
Terrific. Thanks, Marco. Those are very important points. It gets to also the difference between the network and the market, and this gets kind of convoluted as well, in the context of platforms. And speaking on this point, we'll move to Feng, also building on your own, recent work where we have, moving also to some of the specific practice, particularly firms, platform firms getting into the territory of, complementors, self-preferencing practice, right, that are kind of under, the radar of the antitrust. But, when I explain, how the platforms work to students, I used to say this, right? I mean, in traditional market, the market is fixed, and it speaks along, the points of Marco here. But platforms, can actually make, that boundaries disappear in a sense, right? They can expand in different directions by enacting upon, the interactions there. And so, some of this practice that we tend to see as bad, right? I mean, they're actually good if you look from the other side for the consumer, in many cases. So turning to the question, right, Feng, this goes, to the principle of fairness, right? So that this, if you enter into the complementors, but you also act as, the market manager, but this is unfair because, you have asymmetric power. You might use some of the learning from, the interaction and the data that, these guys are actually co-producing. And so basically you're sort of abusing your dominant position. So that's, in the traditional thinking, that would be the case. But you also show, in your 2 recent papers in different contexts, right? And retail, but also apps, that actually the platform, when does step in, it also increase, right, the welfare for the consumers. It expands the market afterwards. So what do we take here? Is fairness what we have to use as a, principle, or should we stick, to consumer welfare and knowing that, some business users might also, lose from this dynamics?
Thank you so much, Carmelo, and also thanks for involving me in this exciting panel. Yeah. So as you mentioned, right, this phenomena is becoming more common today, right? If you look at our big platforms, right? I mean, pretty much all of them are doing some of it, right? Either like some kind of getting into the competition with their market participants, or leveraging their market position to enter like in adjacent space into adjacent spaces. The challenge here, right, as you also mentioned, is that this is a very complex environment in the sense that we have a multi-sided markets, right? And sometimes it's just not two. We're not just having two sides. We have probably more like 3 or 4 sides. So there will be like a lot of spillover effects, right? And also we have a lot of participants on each side, right? So what's unfair for one participant might be actually great for another participant, right? So it's actually quite important, right, for us to actually do as a result to do more empirical work, try to understand like the benefits and the costs, right? So as you mentioned, like I have several pieces of research looking at this space, right? In the Amazon case, I show that even though, right, Amazon is copying third-party sellers' product strategy may actually harm these third-party sellers, but on the other hand, it brings benefit to consumers because like the version offered by Amazon tend to be kind of at a lower price point, right? And also Amazon is actually more efficient in delivering such products, right? And also in the app space, right? So even though like Apple, Google sometimes may kind of release products that are actually identical to the functionalities offered by third-party app developers, but I mean, there could be some efficiency gain in the sense that it actually helps reduce redundant development efforts. Right. So one example is that, I mean, if you look at like the number of flashlight applications being developed for iOS or Android, right, you can easily find like probably hundreds of such applications, right? And but after Apple and Google released their own versions of flashlight applications, these app developers may actually shift their kind of development efforts into some other areas, right? Which may actually bring like additional variety, right, to basically the cell phone users. And also, Carmelo, you also forgot that we actually had a paper, right, a working paper looking at the video game consoles, right? And in that paper, we actually
for sure, you know, I've done.
Yeah, I mean, we should.
But please go ahead. You're welcome, you know, to speak about our own research.
And we should keep doing this self-preferencing, right? I mean, and you leveraging platforms, yeah, like this. And so in that paper, right? I mean, the core idea is that I mean the first-party games introduced by Xbox and PlayStation, right, or other consoles actually could be beneficial to third-party game developers because these first-party games tend to be blockbuster games. As a result, they actually expand the user base, right? They generate lots of excitement in the marketplace, right? So as long as these third-party game developers, right, have differentiated offerings, they actually could benefit from like this expansion of the installed base of consoles, right? So there are lots of like kind of potential games. That's one thing, and also as you could see that in each case, right? I mean, the games could actually take place on different sides of the market, right? And also we should also think about like a long-term impact on like a kind of a third party's innovation incentives, right? So, and I don't think the literature has done a good job kind of basically demonstrating the long-term impact because of all the limitations about the data collection and also, I mean, and also accurately establishing some causal evidence, right? But kind of just intuitively, right? This is also not very clear in the sense that if you think about in the Amazon case, right? Is Amazon's behavior, right? I mean, by directly sourcing some kind of products and sell by itself, going to kind of reduce third parties' incentives like from discovering new products and bringing them onto the Amazon marketplace? It's not very clear because, I mean, if we assume that the third party, the barrier to entry is very low, right? In the sense that you can easily, if there is an interesting product you discovered, right? It's actually very easy to bring to the Amazon marketplace, right? Given the infrastructure Amazon is providing. And as long as you can kind of make money for a period of time. Third-party sellers would continue to bring new kind of products, right? Discover new products and bring them onto the Amazon marketplace. Even if they anticipate like maybe like 6 months down the road, they might face competition from Amazon, right? So as a result, I mean, across different platforms, the incentives could be very different, right? And if you ask, for instance, some hardware manufacturer for Intel's platform, like this Intel's microprocessor, they might think very differently in the sense that if like 6 months down the road, I might face competition with Intel, I may not actually want to kind of incur the substantial cost of developing that product in the first place, right? And so this is one aspect we need to actually do more, do a better job. And the second thing is also we need to really also try to understand the incentives, right, of why platforms are doing this. And in many cases, it's not necessarily about profit maximizing. For instance, like I've done some work like interviewing companies like JD, right? One of the big e-commerce player in China. And JD also has this kind of a dual kind of a roles in the sense that it's a marketplace, but it's also a big retailer, right? And the JD also doesn't want third-party sellers to sell in certain categories. But the primary reason was that JD wanted to minimize counterfeits, right? So for instance, like if you think about like the category for Gucci bags, JD would like to just source from Gucci directly instead of relying on third-party sellers. So JD actually banned certain categories so that third-party sellers couldn't even compete, right, with JD. So this is not to kind of harm third-party sellers to some extent by reducing competition. This to some extent is actually to kind of help consumers, right, to making sure that the products are most products are authentic, and also JD can develop a reputation which would help it to compete against other kind of e-commerce giants like Alibaba, right? And also in some cases, like for instance, it's also not very clear that by making innovation available to all developers, right, is necessarily a bad thing, right? So for instance, like Apple, right, by making the flashlight kind of feature available kind of as a default on the platform, and also all developers can just leverage that feature when developing applications that require, for instance, flashlight kind of features, right? So this actually reduces the development cost for everybody, right? So it's not good news, right? If you have like a standalone flashlight application, because I mean, most likely your application will lose popularity. But for other developers, they may benefit from this. So this space, right? I mean, is actually quite complicated. So I think we really need to kind of one is to understand the impact, the outcome, right, better, and the second is to understand the motivation a little bit better, right? So from there, we could try to kind of have a sense, right, whether this is kind of anti-competitive or whether actually it's pro kind of a competition and maybe beneficial.
So yeah, I mean, thank you for this point. And you know, I think that there's an additional point here, building also some of the questions that we're receiving from the chat, which is about distribution of value, right? So, I mean, so how value is split, not just how value is created, because I mean, there seems to be no doubt here that no one is challenging, you know, that platforms created very value. I mean, we are targeting platforms because they're creating, you know, a lot of value, right? So everybody loves platforms. There's a love affair here, and but you know, some of the regulators, you know, are losing love in this, but not the consumers certainly, right? But the problem is that maybe the problem is that there is also an increased asymmetry in how this value is distributed in the market, right, between the platform and those participating in the platform. So it seems that it's, I mean, to me, you know, if you were to see this in a different way, it seems to me that platforms are making, you know, the markets working almost at the perfect competition level that we see in a 101, you know, econ book, with the only difference that because they operate the market, you know, there's a lot of value for the consumers, you know, minimum value in terms of the value capture for, you know, rents, if you would call, right, for those participating into it. But the platform is, you know, is actually benefiting a lot, right? So it's gaining a lot of value simply because it sits on, you know, millions of transactions, and therefore, you know, small benefit out of millions of transactions by regulated privately the market, you know, it amounts to large value capture by the platform. So back to the principle of fairness or consumer value, is this share of value, you know, something that needs to get into the picture? Is this the problem why we're targeting, you know, the platforms, because we don't like them to make a lot of money?
So I guess like I mean the picture is actually going to be more complicated than this, right? So it's sometimes it's not always the case that one side got harmed, the other side is getting all the benefits. So we worry about the kind of the equality or fairness in platforms actions, right? So because I mean like in some industry, for instance, like in the case in Australia where like the Apple actually had a lot of kind of issues with the banks, right? Essentially large banks in Australia, because Apple wanted to charge a fee for Apple Pay, right? When banks joined Apple Pay, and also Apple also wanted kind of also prevented these banks gaining access to this MFC technology, so that banks had the difficulty of developing like Apple Pay equivalent applications, right? So, but in that case, actually, I mean, you would think that there are outside options, right? So Android is also there, and also these banks are actually very powerful themselves, right? They have all the resources. So Apple's actions actually encourage all these banks to innovate, right? So banks came up with lots of other innovations, right? I mean, so the market becomes more competitive, and it's actually in the end like if you think about all the innovation introduced by banks, such as this tap and go, right, system, right? So where you just kind of tap your card on a device and you can the payment is done. Sometimes you will see that it's actually even more efficient than taking out your phone, right, and putting in your passcode to unlock it, then try to find the app, right? Launch the app and do the transactions, right? So this actually allow the banks, right, to be more innovative, maybe beneficial for the banks, and also allow the consumers to benefit, right? So as a result, like in some cases, right, it's not very clear that there will be kind of inequality issues as a result of platforms' actions, right? So again, right, I go back. So I would say that cases are very different. We really have to understand the basically available options for each players, right? And we also need to understand like the incentives and the all the kind of spillover effects in the marketplace.
Perfect. Thank you, Feng. I mean, your point is perfect because it allows me to open in this other, practice and these outside options, right? Alternatives. And going back, to one of the principles that is there in the regulation, proposal, this dependency, right, on platform. When you are dependent, you have this, right? So going back to Hannah, right, they've done work, multi-homing and structure, how this, is this really what we have to look, that by just allowing, more multi-homing, are we de facto reducing, this dependency? Or as also Marco suggested, right, I mean, each platform as a gatekeeper in it, small or large, right? I mean, it creates dependency in any case. So yes, the notion of competitive bottlenecks, right? It doesn't matter if you're small, it's still a competitive bottleneck.
So in many ways, I agree with Marco. So first of all, there's the theoretical research or economic research on multi-homing, especially multi-homing on both sides. It's kind of catching up with the market. Originally, the platforms would require, adoption of platforms would very often require dedicated hardware. So if we think about video game consoles, you would need to have a console that for not many people just naturally would multi-home, even if the games would multi-home. So we'd very much have multi-homing on one side, but very little on both sides. Now that the more modern, I would say, platforms are just app-based. You don't need a dedicated hardware. It is far more easier for both sides to multi-home. So if we think about Uber and Lyft, multi-homing on both sides is trivial technically. So now the question is, how does it affect really the structure of the market, the market power, and the bottlenecks? And here I would say that once we account for multi-homing on both sides, then looking at the size of the market may be more misleading than other factors. And this is along the lines as Marco said. So imagine now 3 platforms in the market. One is a large platform, almost twice the size of the other ones. The other 2 are small platforms. But the large platforms has no exclusive users. All the users on the large platform are on one of those other platforms. But the other platforms, being more focused, smaller, maybe more dedicated to a particular cause, have some unique exclusive users. Now, which one has more market power? Which one is more of a bottleneck? And I would say that the platforms with more exclusive users would be more of a market power, would have more market power and be more of a bottleneck than the large platform. But if we start looking at exclusive users, we actually face a challenge from the implementation side, because it's very often difficult for the platform itself to know whether its users are exclusive. And in some cases, even for a regulatory body, it may be difficult to establish how many users are exclusive. And this may be, so if you think about Uber and Lyft, yes, everybody is uniquely registered because we give credit cards, you provide a driver's license if you are the driver, a credit card if you are a user. But if you think about maybe a dating site or even a social media site, you don't need to provide your real identity, so nobody really knows how many exclusive users there are for a particular platform. So that may provide, or that may increase regulatory issues. Size is not enough to watch out for anti-competitive behavior here. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of the points.
Yeah, so I would like to to go back to this point on exclusivity and multi-homing, right? So and this asymmetry in size, right? Because on the other hand, as we've seen in some industries, some of the studies, particularly for instance the video game, but also some of your work in dating platforms, right? So sometimes there's exclusivity, right? I mean, when it comes to the small platforms, allows them to differentiate, right? And therefore to compete, to better compete with the big platforms. So it's actually a way to, coexist in the market. And if you get rid of that, exclusivity part, right, we might also get rid basically of an effective competitive strategy for those small platforms. So then, we got back basically to size be the only dimension for the consumers. And that, we know that the big platform is going to win. So should we allow, should we force multi-homing on the big platforms and allow, for exclusivity on the small, or again, size here is not really what matters?
So I don't think that size matters. I just give an example where the size, the size may go in the opposite direction as the market power. Differentiation may be, so exclusivity may come from differentiation in the products that you're providing, or differentiation in the focus of the platform. All right, so I did work on online dating platforms, and there are specialized platforms for people who like snakes, right? So you don't need to force multi-homing in this case. Multi-homing is there. The choice to multi-home is there. It's just there will be a chunk of population that is not going to go to that website, and so this is why I would differentiate between the exclusivity practices imposing exclusivity and the exclusivity that is just endogenous. And even with endogenous exclusivity, just by focusing on a particular group of people to serve them better, you may actually extract even more surplus from them. So that may be an issue. Then when it comes to exclusivity practices, this is kind of an interesting topic, because even if we ban exclusivity provisions stating explicitly you cannot be part of this competing network, there are other ways to increase or to impose exclusivity that are indirect. So for example, your compensation depends non-linearly on the number of, on effort or number of hours that you are spending on our platform. If your compensation increases exponentially, for example, or increases more than proportionally, then it is going to indirectly induce exclusivity. So those are kind of more sneaky tools that are, or more indirect tools that may be more difficult to regulate.
Thank you. We'll consider this point. I have a slightly different view, but this is great. So I go to Daniel for, we're basically discussing a lot of trade-off at the end of the day, right? So, and the platforms themselves, that's what they do. They manage this trade-off between the different conflicts and the different incentives that are on the different sides, and they try basically to take decisions, right? What trade-off and factors then we should, consider when it comes to the regulatory properties, I would say, right? I mean, if we think about principles. And Daniel, you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So before beginning, I'll just say that in a consulting capacity, I do work for a number of platforms, to Marco's point, across many different industries, because it turns out everybody's increasingly a platform. With that, let me begin, as we think about these different trade-offs, two models that Jacques began with, but I want to tease out a little more. One is a competition law model, which is focused mostly on ex post enforcement. In Europe now, part of Jacques thinking about this in a paper suggests moving more to an ex ante regulatory role for competition law. That looks a little bit different than what we've had, and I don't think it's just in Europe. There are these shifts globally. The other, which Jacques also mentioned, was regulation taking on some competition-like features. There's a nice paper just to understand how this might work practically in terms of implementation under law by Meredith Pickford. And to Jacques' point of flexibility and experimentation being paramount in terms of this trade-off of innovation and value creation on the one hand and efficiency, presumably short run on the other, I see it somewhat differently, which is, what do we regulate? Why do we regulate? How precisely do we regulate? Where are the overlaps and where are the gaps across a number of different regulatory bodies? And so ultimately, however you want to regulate, this is where law comes in. This is why the business school professors hate the lawyers, because they say, when are they going to sue? And it really comes down to the following. Ultimately, whatever regulatory regime you have ultimately has to hold up before some kind of juridical body. And therefore, we have to think about what are the legal presumptions, to your point of the trade-offs and factors. Legal presumptions are based very imprecisely on economic presumptions. Those presumptions, I would say, are based imprecisely on presumptions about how technology and innovation work. And a lot of the economic models that we use in competition law and in regulation focus exclusively on the econ literature, not enough on the strategy literature, the IS literature, or the marketing literature that many people participating today are very much in the forefront of the discussion, of the research. Now, if we misunderstand the dynamics of how these markets work and all the different types of presumptions we make, we then misunderstand how to optimize the regulatory response. And to the point of fairness or privacy or any of these other kinds of issues, I have to ask, and this goes to Jacques' other brilliant insight, if we're thinking about the economics of regulation, the question I have is there a hierarchy of these different values if we do not have a singular economic goal? If so, what is the mechanism that mediates across the hierarchy of this different goal? We don't know. So I actually don't think that flexibility and experimentation is what we want yet. I think we need, before that, the first order is, can we understand these relationships to create a system that works at 80% effectiveness before we even begin? That said, and this goes again to the question, I think it's a big cosmetic to say different business models might be treated differently. In a sense, all firms are profit maximizing, and we could conceive of strategies designed to leverage market power regardless of what they're doing. Search results, cloud platform, vertically integrated devices and services. So I'd say, what are the trade-offs we consider? I'd say before we do that, we focus not on the red herring of the business model, but on the actual conduct. And so in a regulatory response, we have to think of the heterogeneity of the different types of business models and their different value propositions, but wed them to some kind of enforcement and regulatory scheme that is more generalist. And this gets to the sort of main point I want to say, doesn't destroy the value of the platforms and their ecosystems, building off of some of the brilliant insights that Marco and Hannah and Feng had mentioned. So if we think about the GAFA companies in particular, because even if we're not thinking about them, apparently that's what everybody else is thinking about. These are among the most innovative companies in the world, haven't stopped pouring money into R&D, new areas like AI, virtual reality, improving internet access to remote areas beyond their core competencies. So, you know, you probably saw in the paper earlier this week, DeepMind discovered how proteins could fold based on their molecular composition. I think that's cool. I'm not quite sure what that means, but all my scientist friends think it's cool. So where does that sort of leave us in terms of thinking about this tension? So does the current direction lead to regulatory proposals or enforcement such as self-preferencing or data silos that significantly harm the efficiencies that are generated from the current integration? Fundamental question. Are these approaches severing feedback loops and network effects that result in value creation for users and the economy more broadly? Other critical question to that point. And so rather than cut across these efficiencies, maybe we ask, is there an alternative path through which we explore options that would seek not to remove the efficiencies, but might aim to redistribute those efficiencies and essentially preserve the value of the platforms? And I draw a distinction between some kind of fact-based inquiry, that's the traditional competition-based inquiry, where, you know, where there's a clear perception of the problem, to the more regulatory approaches of prohibitions or orders, which are a little more complicated. So I think this is a highly complicated area, and there's such political pressure from both the populists of the left and the populists of the right across, it seems, every country to do something. So I'd say we should do something, but we should identify what is the goal. And once we have the goal, we can better understand what are the regulatory mechanisms to deal with this very complex balance of issues. And if we have multiple goals, we need to figure out how to mediate these goals. And this is where some people on this panel, and indeed a number of the researchers, are saying, you know, you're assuming that only government does this. A lot of, you know, platforms and their ecosystems have their own market-based way of dealing with these governance issues. And I think that's something else that we need to keep into consideration as we think about how to do these set of trade-offs. We do want to leave certain things to the market.
Okay, great points. I think that, you know, on the note of goal, actually, I will do two things now. That we're going to open for a little break of 8 minutes or so before, you know, we give some time also to Pierre to organize himself. He's joining from another panel. So Pierre, you know, is specializing on addressing panels. We're going to do this break in two ways here. You help yourself with coffee. I'm going to do now right now and bring it here. But, you know, don't leave, don't disappear. I will invite the audience to fill the poll. So we have a set of questions on this principle. So we want to basically you to reveal your preferences. So this is an exercise to, you know, to self-reveal basically preferences. We're going to launch the poll now. So during this coffee break, please, you know, take the poll here, the survey. And we will, you know, discuss openly, even, you know, again, the audience, please ask questions and chat. You know, this is really a coffee chat now. If you have any points you want to deliver also on the poll. And to the panelists, I will, you know, invite you to think on this goal. What should be the goal, right, of such regulation, if any, and we can, again, we can have this during this coffee chat if you want. I'm gonna help myself, you know, with a coffee and be right back in 1 minute. And this is reflected also in our poll. I would like, you know, to resume this. And if if we have a look here quickly, it seems that there are some points where we have strong convergency. The fairness seems to be, you know, a guiding principle, at least in terms of desiderata here from people. And also it seems that, you know, consumer welfare is a bit outdated here. Again, speaking about preferences. there is ambiguity here on the dominant position, right? When we get into more technical issues, okay, how do we do this, right? I mean, not quite sure here, right? So, and also in terms of data, it's an interesting result that, if data should be made open to everyone on the platform, here it seems that, slightly preferences for no, but of course split, and also what should regulators focus on when assessing data implications. Again, here there seems to be a slight preference for specific implications rather than specific data practice. So it doesn't matter what you do, but what's the consequence of that, which I guess raise further problems from a pragmatic point of view if you had to write a regulation. All right, so on this, there is no better person to inform us than Pierre Regibeau.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't join before, but from what I've overheard, both at the end of the presentation and the informal discussions that ensued, some of the points that I'm going to be making will have echoes in some of the earlier presentation. Now, could you move to the next slide, please?
1 second.
You're gonna have to move.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay. No, it works. Okay, I also should say that whatever I'm saying is, of course, not the Commission's position. I should add that although my team and for myself have been involved at some stages in the process of helping design the DSA and the DMA, at this stage, I'm no more knowledgeable than average about what is actually going to be the final text. So don't try to infer anything from what I'm going to say today. So I start a little bit like Jacques. We start with a bunch of specificity, economic characteristics of digital markets. I start with my own specificities, which are not at all the same as Jacques, which doesn't mean that they're incompatible. I'm just essentially looking at the beast from a different angle, but I would otherwise have completely agreed with the list that Jacques has as well. So at a maybe more macro level than Jacques, what I see as the main specificities is that digital industry tend to be data intensive, they tend to use algorithms, and they tend to be modular. So what I'm going to try to do very simply, and not too ambitiously in this talk, is to see what follows from that and what issues are raised by those characteristics, and then say a word about which of the various tools that we might have at our disposal might be best suited to deal with each of those issues, and at the same time raise awareness of the fact that we might try to deal with some of those issues doesn't mean that there might not be unintended consequences that we should be aware of. So let's start with data intensive, and then on the one side is of course the whole notion of privacy. What do platforms have to do to keep the privacies of the people they get the data from, whether they are kind of users or not? This, to some extent, it's also intricately linked to the issue of ownership, because if I have ownership of my own data, I'm in a better position to kind of negotiate privacy conditions with you than if I don't have ownership of my own data and so on. Now, in diagnosing discussions, there was an issue of, well, if things like privacy and so on also matter in our debate, there's only going to be one part of a trade-off. And therefore, how do we kind of mediate between this dimension of the trade-off and other dimensions of the trade-off? And very practically, very pragmatically, what I would propose at this stage is that we don't mediate. And what I mean by that is that I propose that in terms of ownership and privacy, we set basic rules that we think are essentially rules that are bare minimum that everybody would agree on. Then see what we can do with the rest of the systems and the rest of the trade-off. And then we can eventually revisit other issues like privacy and ownership and eventually converge. Like this, it prevents having to continuously worry about a trade-off, which is really, really very hard to assess. Now, when we talk about an industry which is data intensive, you also run into all of these discussion about data being the new oil and all this kind of stuff. Also, all of the arguments that we've heard, for example, in the context of the Google Fitbit potential mergers, saying, oh, you know, if you put this bit of data with this bit of data, I mean, there's almost kind of a fusion reaction and infinite energy is released, and you are in a world of your own, and you can therefore dominate the industry. Well, yes, we agree. The issue of scale, scope, but also obsolescence, how long is data really useful, are absolutely crucial to a competitive assessment of many things, including mergers in this sector of the economy. But as I've said in other conferences, we know almost nothing about this issue of scale, scope, and obsolescence in data. We have some idea in the limited world of search, but for example, going to the Google Fitbit mergers, if you put together the whole set that Google already has in terms of information about you with the limited set that they might get from Fitbit, how much would that help them in targeting advertising? From enormously to not at all, we actually don't have a clue. So that's one first difficulty that we face. In terms of algorithms, and that goes a little bit to Jacques' own emphasis on transparency, the problem is really limited transparency. It's hard to see, and not only to see, but to monitor what algorithms actually do. It's hard for rivals to see, it's hard for consumers to see, it's hard for competition and regulators to see. And we'll come back to what the implication of this might be. And then finally, in terms of modularity, and I think it's, you know, I'm sure the exception, but I think it's quite striking that in most digital activities or digital platform, you know, the playing with modules as we did when we were kids with kind of those LEM modules we put together seems really being part of the game. But what that means is that it creates big issues in terms of interfaces and therefore interoperability. But also because if you have different aspects of what you set to your system, it's a little unlikely that all consumers are going to acquire the parts interested in a simultaneous manner. There might be sequential involvement with the platform. That also brings back to the fore the issue of competition in the aftermarket, potential dominance and abuse of dominance in aftermarket, which is something that had gone a little bit in the back burner within the field of competition policy. May I have the next slide, please? Okay. So now let's see what potential issues, potential measures might be. And here I'm slowly introducing a color coding that I'm going to also use on the next slide. Kind of the dirty brown thing is something that I feel, at least a priori, would be best dealt with by regulation. You will see later that I have another code for antitrust, and then kind of the gray code is things that might be dealt with instruments that are somewhat different from the kind of ex-ante regulation which is being contemplated and from traditional antitrust. Okay, so that's for the color code. So if you look at data, now, yes, I've said that we have to look at privacy and ownership, and maybe we should set minimum requirement a bit on the side now, but even as we do this, there are kind of some trade-offs that we cannot really avoid. We have to make sure to at least preserve the incentive to generate, collect, and organize those data. You know, data might be like oil, but like oil, it needs to be refined and collected and extracted in order for them to be used. And because of that, even in terms of ownership, for example, one might want to distinguish between different types of data. You know, data which is generated by the fact that consumers use my own product, data generated by people who sell on my platform, data that I collect through cookies from the activities of people who use my platform outside of my platform. It is not clear to me that the ownership regime should be the same for all of this kind of data, and which ownership regime might be most effective in a little bit of a Gaussian manner might go to the care that we should put in trying to preserve some kind of incentive to collect and organize data. Okay. Now, this clearly is not the province of antitrust and competition policy. Now, when you look at the economies of scales and obsolescence, that of course goes to the idea of the fact that scale scope might be the source of significant barriers to entry. Now, of course, that's in itself is not an abuse of dominant position, but it means that some transactions and some mergers might be seen as ways to comfort or increase a dominant position. So I'm at this stage, you're not discussing within a specific case, as agnostic as to how wide data access remedies should be. But what I'm not agnostic about is the fact that we should be ready, have a world where data remedies could be enforced relatively easily. And that might involve making sure that there's at least some commonality of standard of formats in the way databases are kept, so that if transferred in addition and combination of database are called for some reason later, this is not overly difficult. Now, moving to the issue of limited transparency due to algorithm, one well-known concern is a good line of reasoning that people like Jacques have pushed, saying, oh, you know, those algorithms can be the basis for improved tacit collusion. For a reason I'm not going to go through here, and I've discussed elsewhere, I'm actually not that concerned about that. I'm really much more concerned about limited transparency because it is limited transparency. And in this sense, there are essentially two prongs to that. The first one is remedies. If we do impose remedies for antitrust violation, and that involves essentially putting some restriction on what algorithm can do, given how hard it is to monitor the algorithm, how do we do this? And that might be one of the benefits of having a specialized regulator that might have a better ability to enforce and design those kind of remedies. There's also the issue of consumer choice, and this could be construed, as we'll discuss briefly later, both maybe something which is kind of exploitative from a dominant platform, and therefore I give turn to the consumer in terms of the choice that they're going to have and what they're going to see in terms of information on my platform that really doesn't give us a good deal. It's not an excessive price, but that has essentially the same effect. Maybe we should look into those kind of things. But there's also maybe something a bit more fundamental, is that there are practices that have the effect of, and sometimes seem to be designed for, limiting the information available to consumers when making choices between products, and often including the platforms on product and other products. And there, although I'm very aware not to destroy synergies and so on, I'm much, much less sympathetic because, as we know, we always talk about competition, but the fuel of competition is information. And if you essentially start restricting the kind of information that consumers would need to make choices that would underpin competition, that I think is something we should be very, very concerned about. Now, if you look at modularity, well, aftermarkets, I'm not going to say anything special here today, but what we face essentially is a trade-off, is essentially kind of leveraging, you know, anti-competitive tying, maybe construed as a refusal to supply in some cases. But at the same time, we don't want to be really cutting with big scissors through the complex environments, the complex ecosystems that many of those platforms are designing, because not only don't we know what kind of synergies today severing those things will damage, but since we don't know what the development plans are, we don't know what future synergies it might damage as well. So I think that there we actually have to be quite careful, which is why I'm much more, at least at this stage of the industry, eager to favor interoperability remedy or again precondition like standard setting and so on, favoring the possibility of interoperability, than any move to kind of reorganize a platform, break them up. I think that generally speaking, and this is my own opinion, this would be premature. Maybe the next slide. I've actually already got
a few minutes left. So
yes. So essentially, this is just for you to see because it's beautiful, but I've already gone through this one, so we can move to the next one, please. So that leaves kind of the elephant in the room, which is the issue of should there be regulation about self-preferencing. Now, I'm fairly queasy about it, I must say. For one reason, we don't quite know what self-preferencing is. And to the extent that it is, you know, treating your own business not quite in the same way as you treat kind of rival business in your platform, we know that that can be anti-competitive, but that can be very, very many also efficiency reasons to do this. So at this stage, I'm not saying that there should not be anything in the regulation about self-preferencing, but it should refer to really what I would call naked self-preferencing, something, you know, clear-cut. You give yourself something that you really could and should give to the others. There's no efficiencies. Maybe we can say something about this at the time. I would be somewhat reluctant to go further into ex-ante regulation, at least at this stage. Then the next slide, please. Then there's the issue of dynamics, precisely because I think that one has to start fairly carefully about a regulation. It's important to have a continuous updating. And therefore, you need learning. You need learning, you need a process, which might be this kind of quasi-market investigation that has been proposed, that could make regulatory rules more precise when it seems that they're not precise enough. And going the other direction, you know, the other side of the conveyor belt, coming from competition cases, maybe if we start looking at competition cases and then some leitmotif reappear, so that after a while we're quite confident that given type of conducts are bad across a wide enough set of platforms, then maybe those can kind of slowly move from the realm of competition policy to the realm of regulation. The next slide, please. And then finally, I think that there's been a lot of comment about, oh, you know, we should be very prudent and so on. I agree with that. We should also be patient. Even if we had the best absolute process, with the best absolute mind, doing the best they can at this stage for designing regulation and possibly modifying our antitrust approach, there's no way we would get everything right. Precisely because, as has been mentioned by others, it's such a complex environment. It's not just economically complex, as some people have mentioned. In order to truly understand this industry, you also need to read more the organizational literature, the strategy literature, the management of technology literature. This is really a complex animal. We cannot get it right, certainly not right now. Right? So because of that, and despite the populist pressure, one should not try to cover the regulation of behavior just because it's in the press. We should only regulate the one that we feel comfortable. It's a good idea to regulate at this stage. And then I will finish a question, which is a bit equivalent to what I heard before, which was, what are we trying to achieve? Well, the other side of this question is that what would be success? How would we measure success? And I think that's an issue that has not been discussed enough. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I like especially also one of your remark on current status of politics. So that I think it was, you know, a call to be made. I think we have time. I mean, we're cutting a little bit of time, but you know, if there's one questions or maybe just one questions. So there were these issues on you know, there was brought forward more on data, and it doesn't seem yet to be, you know, quite clear that, you know, why data should not be treated as you know, as good, and particularly when it comes in terms of the implications. I think that we will discuss this much more in the next panel, but moving more to the leveraging part of the data, right? I mean, where it seems that, you know, this patient is not there. Pierre, what is your say?
So on the leveraging data, you mean?
Yeah, because it seems that that's where, you know, people are start being a little bit itching, right? I mean, and but privacy and all these issues that were politics, right? I mean, there are pressure to act upon, to you know, to give an answer, right? I mean, to citizens.
Yes, but again, I think one has to, again, if we refer to the Google Fitbit transaction, I think it's very important to separate the concerns that people, including people like our commissioner and myself, might have about the privacy implication, you know, the democracy application of having platform, having more and more different type of data about consumers. That's fine, but that's not a competition policy issue. So competition policy issues only arises if essentially the kind of data that you have can be first combined with benefits, and second, if this is not just simply an efficiency offense, but if you can kind of demonstrate with enough evidence a likely nefarious effect from that. And if you look at all the discussion about this transaction and others, evidence is very hard to find in many of those very, very enthusiastic papers.
Thank you very much. I think that we discuss more of these points on the next panel, but terrific. Thanks, Pierre, for your keynote. And then I left the floor to Joanna.
Thank you.
I think what we have here is a very interesting discussion where we basically treat digital platforms as traditional businesses, and we focus a lot on their traditional business aspects. Maybe we should focus a little bit more on the technology and the data that these platforms are creating and are leveraging, because this is the substance of the platforms, at least in my view. And I have a panel of some specialists that they will present their view on data practices and how actually this can contribute to value creation, which is what regulators are focusing here, both for the platform and the stakeholders and participants in particular. And I would like to start with Yannis Kalinikos and his take on it.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Carmelo, for inviting me into this very thoughtful event. I heard so many interesting things during this talk. I connect specifically very much with the last speaker, Pierre, but also Daniel Sokol. And I think, to say some things which they themselves may not want to say, or they may be opposed, but I think elaborate on some of the things they said. Let me start myself by saying that I also, as many others, think that regulation is important in a democratic and but also economically competitive society. We do need regulation in economic policy in society as such, but it also needs substantial insights to the domains it aspires to regulate, lest it may inflict more damage than promote the public good, which is after all the goal of regulation. This has been reinforced. All the speakers have talked about that. Now, according to my own understanding, a major problem in this regard is that we don't understand very well the functioning of the digital economy. And what I heard here today was wonderful, but also reinforced my impression that of the, what I call the compound platforms, technologies, data, not all things are properly understood, and I'm afraid that they are very skewedly understood, many of them. On platforms, while there is good scholarship around platforms, and I heard a few very interesting talks here, this scholarship needs to be amended beyond the dominant understanding of platform as multi-sided markets governed by network effects and demands economies of scale. In some conspicuous ways, platforms are not markets. I say this strongly, are not markets, but authority systems, organizations, corporations, planning systems, in the way Kenneth Arrow described them already in 1974 in his little, small, brilliant book on the limits of organization. Now, I'm saying this because the hybrid nature of platforms needs to be better addressed. Why? Because platforms operate in a decentralized or distributed way that reminds us of markets, but in the end are also centralized economically and in terms also of social power. And this ambiguous and ambidextrous orientation of platforms to some way maps one important aspect of the social contract. Bear with me, I will explain this, which is the way modernity as society has regulated the private and the public sphere. Platforms cannot operate unless they cut across privacy and the public sphere. And this is something which we need to think about. It requires a more radical rethinking of the place of platforms and businesses in society. On the second thing, and I can elaborate on this later if I have time, on the second thing, which is technology, I spoke about a compound, platform technologies data. Of the second thing of that compound, which is technology, it's, the situation is also not good. For most social scientists, and I heard even here today, an economist, technology doesn't have causal vocation. It's not a system. It's just a neutral force. It can be used in one way or another. But looked upon historically, such a view is untenable, if not ridiculous. But this is though the prevailing state of affairs. We need to study the dynamics and study the dynamics of technology, specifically in this age of high automation, robotics and AI. This is my second aspect to your question, Joanna, or to the questions we deal here. And the third of aspect, and I think the situation there, and I speak about data, is even worse for several reasons. And I think I only heard about Pierre Regibeau to speak a little bit about data today. For several reasons, data have never been at the forefront of current analysis, of social analysis, of economic analysis, and the forces that shape economic and social behavior. Data is an important force in this. We know currently very little with respect to how data are involved in service production, the making of data commodities, by which I include things like scores, indexes, prediction, audiences, rating systems, and ultimately value creation. And I want to make my key contribution is the following to all of you. Carmelo will continue our discussion. Data is a resource, but is not only a resource like all are. It has distinct qualities that are linked to the capacity of data to do what? Mediate, signify, represent, frame perception, understanding the world. Like money, data are both a resource and a medium, and it cannot be simply treated as a resource. This is not good. We may need, I suggest, a theory of data in social science, in economics, as we have a theory of money. This is absolutely important if we want to understand the digital economy. Otherwise, we project what we know of the industrial economy to a new world. So I finish up and I conclude. I think I spent presumably my time, Joanna. I say that regulation, granted this, I agree we have to do also things in the short term. I speak about bigger things in the long term, but I am with regulation. I just want to issue what many of you have issued as a warning that this is a delicate and fragile territory and we'll have to move to it with a lot of circumspection.
So, Yanni, thank you very much. I understand that platforms are not using data, are not producing data. They are actually treating data as their main substance. And when we talk about regulation of platforms, we should focus on the way that the data are produced and data practices are leading to particular forms of value creation. And I'm sure that our next speakers will elaborate more on that. Thank you very much for your statement. And I would like to move to Panos now. Panos?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm afraid I can't go as deep as Yanis has on this subject. I fully agree with his position, but I guess I will be a little bit more instrumental in my thinking, less sociological. I'll try to be brief. I'll focus on the following trade-off. Value creation from data needs to be incentivized with algorithmic innovations. However, those very innovations very often can negatively impact data security and privacy. And of course, the problem starts with the fact that value creation opportunities from data start to diminish once data is taken out of context because algorithms evolve based on context-specific learning. I believe this is actually something that Jeff mentioned in his talk during the last DMC Forum. And I actually find his work with Yorgos and Marshall on this to be right on the spot. As they argue, even though the horizontal breakup of platforms on grounds of anti-competitive practices could potentially hold true legally, and I'm not, I don't come from, you know, I don't have a good understanding of legal issues or regulatory issues, but I find their argument to make sense. In terms of value creation, it is a bad idea to break up platforms. So if the objective, right, if the objective is to improve and enhance value creation, then platform firms should be allowed to run their algorithms within their markets while offering incentives for vertical integration for upstream complementers. Now, of course, there is the other side of the coin, is data security and privacy. And this is where things start to get muddled, right? Because of the issue of consent and the way data get reused and repurposed across different services and different parties. As Yanni said, data has the potential to mediate, to signify, to represent, and to even act, right? Without often the creator of the data knowing about it, the creator most often being the end users. So that's where the problem lies. Even though end users benefit from platform orchestrated value creation with their data, most often the end user has no input in this process. So do I want Google search to recommend product web pages for me? Do I have a choice over those recommendations? Some end users, I think, would probably answer yes to more recommendations, but most would also want more choice on the ways by which recommendations are made. I think nobody except Google wants to use Google search only to be faced with selectively promote products and services from Google. I think this becomes even more problematic when Google search becomes the default option in Android phones through proprietary API. I think Google does this with a number of proprietary API. So one way forward is to verticalize Google search by taking their model, their algorithmic model, and retraining it within each vertical market with market-specific data provided and managed by firms within those markets. So for travel and accommodation, the same search model could be used, but the data would be managed by the firms within that vertical market. So Google would not be owning the training data, not the outcomes, such as personalized services. This is actually something that Andrew Ng has put forward in the context of manufacturing, and I think it could be applied in other markets. So the idea is that algorithmic models get nested in vertical markets. Now, the original trade-off doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear, but it only becomes compartmentalized. And then parties within each vertical market have to develop their own governance rules for value creation from data while accounting for privacy and security concerns. What this model does is it develops a polycentric governance to data and algorithms, as opposed to the centralized models controlled by platforms firms. So just to be clear, I'm not proposing vertical breakups here of platform firms. Platform firms will still play a part in such a verticalization. However, the governance of the algorithmic models and how the data are repurposed will become nested so that any stakeholder with a substantive interest in this would be represented. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Panos. I think this is an interesting solution that perhaps can be discussed later on. At least it's a hands-on solution that we could consider, especially give us an input for regulators and policymakers. I also think that we're getting more and more into the details of how we can address some of these issues. And I look forward to Ulrike Schulz's first statement here about her view.
Okay, well, thanks, Johanna, for inviting me. So, yeah, I guess when I think about platforms, I think of them as configurations. You know, and some in information systems, we use the term socio-material configurations, but ultimately a very complex constellation of technologies, of economic interests, of value-creating mechanisms, and so this idea of, you know, just pulling out the data or sort of paying attention to the data, I think becomes very difficult. In fact, if it were easy to, you know, single out sort of the role of data in these platforms, then I think issues of ownership, data ownership and data privacy, which, you know, Pierre Regibeau had brought up, would be easy, right? If we could sort of untangle the data from the infrastructure that they are on. So, you know, if we think about Facebook and all the content that's being created there, that data would not exist, right, in that form. And if it weren't for the entire infrastructure in which it resides. And I completely agree with Yannis's point that, you know, the data is performative, right? It produces a reality, and it produces a certain kind of person, and it produces a certain kind of sort of economic system and thinking. And so, you know, so from that point of view, it's to me, you know, this issue of regulation. I certainly am, you know, not a lawyer or anybody who can speak to sort of at length about regulation, but I guess I'm sort of skeptical that regulation can get us there, and I think that's sort of a lot of what we've heard here too, and so I guess my take on this is, you know, how can we redesign platforms that, you know, in a way that essentially sets us up for a fairer distribution of the value that gets created, and for issues of data privacy, for example. And, you know, there are, I think, some solutions coming to the fore, and in particular, you know, we see a lot of sort of excitement around the use of blockchain, at least in some of these platforms, namely platforms related to healthcare. Right, and of course that's just a drop in the bucket, you know, but possibly you know, an infrastructure that could move us forward to a place where we as individuals have more control over, you know, what data is basically what data is shared with whom, you know, in sort of these platform environments. So I guess I'm sort of on the side of saying, well, I believe that the market is, you know, in many ways, you know, going to always the technology, and you know, with the technology, the market is always going to find new ways forward. So, you know, even if we manage to regulate, then I am a bit concerned that those regulations would be about a, you know, sort of a mechanism or a sort of a configuration, that essentially is going to be eclipsed by other technologies. And so, to what extent is that then useful, right? And so I guess I'm anticipating that we are going to see new technological solutions to at least data privacy issues and data ownership issues. Because ultimately the difficulty with the data ownership, again, is that the data wouldn't exist if it weren't for the platform, right? So whose data is it? How should we sort of, give control over these things? But I think the other piece that if we do start incorporating, sort of other, if we do build a completely different configuration, platforms that are based on sort of blockchain technology, for example, which then would be completely distributed, right? So you don't have the situation of a proprietary, centralized infrastructure that we currently associate with platforms. Where then the platform owner, right, decides in terms of makes the rules by and large. But if we have sort of this highly distributed peer-based system, then I think as an individual, if I'm trying to fight for my data rights, right now, I'd be facing somebody as large as Facebook. But if it's, a much more distributed kind of system where essentially the nodes that run the system are in competition with one another, then I think the shifts in power look somewhat, the power differentials look somewhat different. And so I guess I'm, again, on the side of thinking about completely different configurations and, with regard to platforms and become very conscious of the fact that the majority of platforms right now are these centralized proprietary infrastructures, and that a lot of the problems, that have been created or that we're seeing, a lot of the harms that we're seeing associated with them come from that technological setup, and that there are alternative technological setups which might move us forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. So if I understand well, your input in this discussion is that somehow, due to the fact that data are so entangled with the information infrastructure, which constitutes the platform, it is kind of difficult, if not impossible, to find a way to regulate and control them, right? And therefore, we should find alternative technological organizational forms like the ones perhaps promoted through blockchain, that it's more decentralized, that will kind of address some of the issues that are raised from regulators. Of course, the question is, how can you do that? Should you just push the platforms away or regulate them in such a hard way that they will be disappearing? That is a very interesting discussion to have here, because yeah, this perhaps these alternative solutions need somebody to promote them. And that is something we can perhaps discuss later on. But before we do so, I would like to hear Yunjin and his initial statement. Yunjin, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me here. So one of the advantages of going last is that you don't really have to say anything, except that you say that I agree with everything that has been said. So, it's interesting, I'm in the midst of a research project looking at the next computing paradigm and value creation. And as a part of the study, we've been talking to several leading technologists in corporates and university labs and Silicon Valleys and investors and so on. And we've been asking similar questions. What are some of the things that they think will happen in the more commercially applied sort of computing paradigm, platforms and so on. That they made, and I think it's reflected in this conversation. The current paradigm is mostly based on data that is generated in online space, social media, search, and blog, and digital contents and e-commerce. And then these platforms are distributed platforms use their own sort of cloud-based infrastructure to leverage that data to generate insights and then to sell more and then maximize user engagement. Then they say, the consensus is that many of these technologists are saying that they are surprised by two things. One is that the type of data and our ability to collect data is now far exceeding our original idea of collecting data from a digital realm. And I think the conversation that we have in academia is hopelessly limited in that sense. If you think about what is happening in the real world with the data that is coming from sensor data, microbiome data, and then genomic data, and so on, the data that they're talking about is not social media data that, the posting that I did on Facebook. Think about Moderna, vaccine. This is entirely software-driven, data-driven exercise. In 2 days, they sequenced, designed messenger RNA data. And essentially what they're doing is that they then printed that data into a serum, transporting into human body and use human body as printer to produce antibody. That's essentially what they're doing. And that's the kind of the data revolution that is taking place in the real world. So from their perspective is that the type of data that is being produced and that the type of data that we can granular and multidimensional data in all realm of human lives is just mind-boggling. And that's what they see as both as an opportunity as well as a concern. The second one is these are all technologists who are studying the AIs and machine learning from very early days. And they all say that they were surprised by how fast technology has evolved, the machine learning in particular, in their ability to predict routine, habitual behaviors or human behaviors. They said the technology has exceeded their expectations. So putting these two things together, they see an opportunity that we could do a lot of things that we could not do in the past, and the technology-wise, those things can be done if we collect the data in a centralized manner. So what is stopping them from doing it? It is primarily, when you actually talk to a lot of these people, they said, we do not want to be on the front page of New York Times and Wall Street Journal as the next Facebook, like violating privacies and all these issues. So oftentimes, I think that the lack of discussion on the unique nature of data and how we handle the uniqueness of data is preventing the society from getting the benefit of data economy. I think that's actually one of the key issues we think about. And I think what is happening here, and Ulrike and others have already mentioned this, there is a interesting awakening among technologists that these social consequences are no longer afterthought. They do not think it is possible that we just build a technology in the most efficient way, and then hopefully the regulators will take care of it, or the sociologists and social scientists will come in and help us to understand how the users should use it. They said, no, we actually need to better understand these issues, and they need to be baked into the very architecture of the technology and architecture of the data. The architecture has to be part of the conversation by design from the beginning. Now, I don't think we will get it right from the beginning. I think, I agree that, we have to have enormous amount of patience. But I agree with Yannis, like every time I speak with him, in that, we lack the understanding of data in a very fundamental way. So oftentimes we hear that data is the new gold. And I think that is absolutely not true. Data is, if I have a different analogy, this is coming from one of the interviews that I did with the ethicist at Carnegie Mellon. And he used the analogy of data being a manure. So he said in the 19th century, as the horse wagons are becoming popular, one of the problems in big cities in Europe were these horse shits. It's everywhere. And it was completely disaster for everybody else, except those companies who are producing fertilizers by collecting these free goods and then reproducing them and producing a very valuable product. So he said, the better analogy that we need to think about is not gold, but these are manured. So no one cared until now. And all of a sudden, everybody walked up and said, that is actually very valuable. That's where we are now. But here's the problem. And again, I think I have to agree with Yanis on this. You know, the uniqueness of the data, and then just like any other digital objects, there are highly combinatorial, and then there are performative and computational. So the value that we produce from data is not known and knowable ahead of time. So the current discussion about consent-based, you know, data sharing and data ownership is completely useless. You know, when you do a medical procedure, doctor comes in and say exactly what they think they will do, and then I consent. You know, when you buy a certain piece of product, I know what that product is going to do, and I consent. Now, when I give my data or when I get data, sometimes I have no clue what I'm going to do. What is the upper bound of the value that will come out of the data? No one knows. So how do we regulate the ownership of such malleable, evolving entity as a part of the economic conversation and ownership and property? It's a highly problematic domain. We still do not really know how to deal with it. And the last point I'd like to make is that, you know, again, I think there's a lot of discussion about, you know, the data ownership as an important piece. But, you know, if you, as long as you continue, as Ulrika mentioned, you know, to continue to have this like a centralized, depending on large infrastructure in terms of producing data, you cannot just turn upside down and say one day, I'm going to give the data that I have about you back to you. It's just impossible, because the data ownership has to be exercised at a very granular record level, the transaction level. That's only when it is useful. And then, you know, the data value is what I would call perishable. You know, what we are trying to do is trying to understand the unknowable state of some entity using computational tools, using partially observed event-driven data to understand what the true state of that particular entity. That's where we get the value. And, you know, that insight is usually very perishable. So, you know, the fact that the data is as is does not give me perishable insight. The perishable insight, the most valuable insights usually come by combining and by computing at the particular moment, and the value disappears. So how do we regulate such unique assets is the challenge that I think we need to have. It's not just a regulatory challenge. I think it is also technological, architectural design challenge that I think we need to have, and also the business model challenge. And then I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Many interesting insights. If I understand well, one of the messages that we could give to our regulators is that data are very situated, are very special in the way that we are using them. So it's kind of impossible to talk about ownership, because you own the origin of the data. And then when the data are computed and they become valuable, it's very difficult to talk who owns what. So maybe in that sense, it's kind of impossible to regulate that. But the question is then, how can we move forward? Should they know about it? Should they, as we heard before, perhaps let it be and focus on regulating some very basic economic implications, and let perhaps, as you suggested, the designer of the platforms or the technologies that they will use this data to act as regulators of this data? So where is the solution? And I would like to hear perhaps other opinions, maybe Yanis or Panos. Do you agree with this approach? Because that could be a very hands-on solution to this problem. Yanni?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an answer, Iona, to your question, for the simple reason that is a very complex question. There may be answers like in the direction of Panos or the direction of other participants that isolate a little area or a specific area of that complex and can introduce one or a number consideration for policy and regulation. But the whole system, the way it's been described by me, others, Young Jean, also Ulrike, is very complex to say something at this moment. and I am not a regulator myself, so I would rather refrain. But I would though want to make a distinction that young Jean forced me to do this, which I think we all should have. We should not, there are social data, transaction data, Facebook, transaction data, Amazon, and sensor data. We shouldn't believe that sensor data and other data are not made but natural. There's nothing natural here. Sensor data even more artificial than social data. There are so many encodings and presuppositions for a movement to reach to the visual space and be recorded as a click of a particular act that in the case of like, for instance, in the Facebook, there are less so many presuppositions. So in a nutshell, what I want to say is that all this system is based on assumption and presumptions about one or another thing, and there's no such a thing as natural data, so we have to see them within this overall context, and our move towards understanding and by extension regulating data needs to look at these overall dynamics of data and the way they are made to serve particular interests and goals.
So, anybody else that would like to comment, panel?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with the rest of the panel. I don't think there is an easy fix, and you can always try to compartmentalize, as I said earlier, the problem in smaller chunks and try to manage it. But still, the trade-offs are there. They don't go away. And just to add another point, I think I absolutely agree with Yunjin. This is not just a regulatory challenge; it's a technological or design challenge. I think it has, and I think regulation has to somehow take into consideration machine learning and automation in the same way that platforms use machine learning and automation to promote their products and to do self-preferencing and to do self-promotion. That's the only way you can govern those kind of practices is again with design and algorithms. So you meet algorithms with algorithms. The scale by which they penetrate different markets is such that you cannot possibly manage with simple regulatory tools. And just make one more point. I said, I made a point about verticalizing, markets through algorithms. There is a big challenge there. How do you define a vertical? Where's the boundary? And I think this is, again, going back to Yannis, we don't understand the data, the essence of data, so that we can define the boundaries, because I think the boundaries are defined by the data parameters. So, and again, there are different types of data, right? There's, for instance, genetic markers in medical data. That's a critical type of data that needs to be managed differently from, say, age and sex, which is another type of data, right? So I think there's different parameters within data, different types of data that could help us define what a vertical market could look like, but the boundaries are bleeding into one another. So again, that's a big challenge. And how do you define markets is again, something that is not easily done.
Thank you very much. Ulrike, any last comment, because we cannot hear you.
Yeah, I think we're all saying very similar things. That we sort of see the role of technology in a big way here, and that in some ways technology has created the problem, And maybe we're naive technologists to think that technology is going to be the only way forward in terms of, you know, dealing with the problems and finding solutions to the problems, right? So fight AI with AI, or fight the scale of data with, you know, the new, more powerful tools. But I also, you know, think, you know, a key theme that's come out of this is just the fact that the technology keeps changing, and that regulation, you know, is always at risk of being too late, too little, too late. And so I, again, you know, think that the solutions need to be elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before I conclude, I want to hear a final remark from Yunjin. Do you think, Yunjin, we lost control and it's totally out of humans? So it's basically technology that has to regulate technology. Are we there?
I don't think so. I mean, it's you know, there are you know, a lot of interesting ideas that are being bubbling up, and you know, that trying different architectural designs and different approaches to solve this very problem. So I'm more hopeful, actually, than many others. I think actually one challenge, though, is that big tech sort of monopoly of you know, these platforms, not so much about data regulations and so on, but anti-competitive sort of like innovation space. It's so easy for big tech companies to buy out or kill these small new ideas coming from the fringes before they begin any tractions, market or institutional arrangement. Because, you know, a true innovation requires not just technology, but it has to co-evolve with our human practices, social norms, and business, you know, arrangements and so on. And I think that the challenge is, you know, just think about COVID, for example, you know, contact tracing. Apple and Google is essentially shutting down all other framework of using, you know, mobile and wearable technology to address this potential problem. You know, in full disclosure, I actually have been working on this project and trying to get the system into app and Google, you know, App Store. And it's not even high-level people who are reviewing it. It's some low-rank, you know, a person who might have an MBA degree is just looking at it and then asking this really stupid, dumb questions like, so, you know, who is your jurisdiction? And we're saying that this is not public health contact tracing app. It is, we are building, you know, digital twin and you know, trying to gain an insight on, and then individuals are using it as a tool. And because they have just one paradigm of how to use technology, anything else cannot even see the daylight, right? It's just totally impossible. So I think that is really problematic. And so some of these innovations, like whether it is blockchain or, you know, decentralized personal data ownership architectures and so on, I worry that they may not see the daylight, you know, because of these sort of, you know, monopolistic behaviors of big tech companies.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all the panelists. This is still fascinating when we converge, and there's always a learning into it, also from our point of view. We're reaching basically to the closing of the forum, so it's time, I think, to move from pure academics to people that then have to deal with what we produce as academics, and then they have the noise of theories and apply them, you know, to reality, and that also help, you know, firms give some directions, because at the end of the day, they are the one translating some of this into action. So, calling on Martina from Copenhagen Economics, thanks for joining. I just want to, you know, we've seen a lot of discussion here, but, you know, what is your takeaway out of this, you know, discussion and the broader discussion on these issues? You know, what are points that are clear from a practice point of view, others that, you know, remain ambiguous and, you know, gives you some headache?
Yes, Thank you, Carmelo. And first, let me say thank you so much for having me here today. It's such an honor to be part of this really impressive panel and series of keynotes that you put together. It's not an easy task with all this input and also what I heard today. So in terms of, well, I think there are some points that are definitely remain ambiguous. One that has been repeated many times today is, what is the objective here? And I think that's really maybe where we should start from. And I've seen in the poll that you made that I think people don't agree to abandon consumer welfare. So is that still the objective? And also it was mentioned creation of value and distribution of value. And I think if we have more clarity on that, then it's easier for us economists and probably also for lawyers who then have to advise different stakeholders, both firms and authorities, to know where to start from. What do we need to measure? Another buzzword that has been repeated very often these days is gatekeepers. I've heard some more input on that today. And I know also the Commissioner Breton, he gave some more information on that recently, but still it's a little bit unclear exactly what this is. I know that one of the characteristics is the impact of these firms on the single market, but what does that mean in practice and how do we measure? And hopefully we will know a bit more on the 15th when the Digital Market Act comes out. Next, also fairness was mentioned today. Again, a very interesting concept, and again, looking at the poll, many agree that that could be a new way of looking at dominance. But again, how do we measure that? Sorry, but as an economist, I like to measure things. And then finally, also the concept of market definition, which is something that economists and lawyers look at. We start from defining the market. What market are we looking at? When we have a lot of players, they are active globally. They cross boundaries both geographically, but also in terms of products and services that they provide. So that also becomes very, very tricky.
In this regard, so there was also a call from Jacques, right, of using also existing tools, so more integration with the existing tools. So there is a call to move away from what is the industrial policies, because this is new, but everything that is new, it builds also something that is not new, and so there's always learning here, right? Some of these models can be used. From your point of view, what do you think of this? I mean, so there are some models there that can be used to tackle at least some of the issues, and would also be interesting to look at those models as a way to depart for new and build the new principles?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think market definition actually provides a very useful starting point. The notice by the Commission is actually quite general and flexible. Although, yeah, we know the Commission is now reviewing it, so let's see what will come out of that. But still, when applying digital markets, that becomes a bit tricky for a series of reasons. One of the tools that one can use is this SNP test. So if you increase prices, what happens? Do consumers switch away to alternatives? Well, that's pretty difficult to implement in markets where the price is zero for consumers. Then the whole competition between online and offline, where products and service characteristics are very different, but still consumers switch between one another. Again, geographic boundaries, and then one point that I think is very interesting is potential competition, which is something that usually you look at in the dominance assessment, but it might become more relevant already in the market definition when we have markets that are so dynamic and where new firms enter and existing firms expand into adjacent sectors and markets. And maybe here actually, and it's something that also I think Daniel mentioned before, it could be useful, at least for us economists, to also look at the more business and management theory to understand better how the business models work, and basically try to solve these challenges together.
Well, I cannot, do anything else but second, that that point. I actually encourage, and the forum is also, it's the mission of the forum. Last, 2 billions question. There's some of the arguments that are put forward, and I think that Pierre brought this. My understanding was in a skeptical terms, right? I mean, this idea that in the Fitbit, a Google case, that the data can actually, they are seen from some economists as a hidden price, right? I mean, we pay in terms of data. And there's now this say that it's been popularized. If you're not the product, if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. We like to make this bold statements that are plenty empty, but then everybody then, takes its own of it. So my question for you is that, it seems that then we start with defining markets for data, right? So that the data becomes the price, but we also hear that, from Yannis, that that's the wrong directions, that we shouldn't treat, data as a good, and, or we shouldn't have, data be treated, as a market thing, but, it's a more complex process that involves, also social aspects and technology aspects. So on that point, what's your say here? Should we treat instead the data as a price, or we should look at data differently?
I don't think I can give a straightforward answer, but so I like what Yannis said about the theory of data. I think that would be interesting to explore. But so we all agree data is important in digital markets. Maybe one thing that would be interesting to explore is how important is data as compared to, for example, the algorithm that is used to collect and elaborate data. Because that links to the, when we hear about providing access to data, so for competitors, access to data firms that they have collected it, then it becomes a bit tricky in terms of incentives to innovate, for example. So if a platform, a company that has come up with its algorithm and that's made it more and more efficient to collect and process data, and of course it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Because also more data helps the algorithm improve. But if then this firm has to open up and provide data to other competitors, then what are its incentives to become even better? And what are the incentives of the competitor to find a new way of collecting data if we can just access the data that is collected already? So this is just to give a little bit of the other side of the coin. I think I don't have the answer, but I think this is definitely an interesting question, again, for us economists. About data, well, you can do a lot. You can do many different things with the same data. You can do the same thing with different data. So that's also, something to look into. And then when we talk about access again, maybe easy to say, but difficult to apply in practice. I'm not a data scientist, but that's what I heard.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, these are all terrific points. I would say, there's not just questions for economists, but questions for scholars. Particularly, I think in this area, what is my impression is that, I mean, we need more of the IS, where IS folks that are still here, to join also the forum and start speaking with economists, right, to influence also the thinking and the learning around data. So the forum, before I thank you all for joining, participating in this terrific discussion. Thanks for your time. I also, relaunch and with a call for work in this area. So, it is the mission of the forum to disseminate knowledge but also pushing us all to explore implications from our work to applied relevant questions that also had to do with the regulatory implication, which unfortunately as management scholars we don't deal much, but then we cannot complain if this is just taken by the economists. So thank you all again for participating. I take also the opportunity to, wish you Merry Christmas to all and holidays. I know it's a bit in advance, but virtual life, we don't have many opportunities to do this. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.